Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week, what will it take to bring Mississippi up to par with our states in terms of economic competitiveness? That's the Mississippi Economic Council's goal. We'll talk to the group's new chairman, Leon Collins, about the way forward. And violent crime is up in Jackson and nationwide. What's driving these trends? And how did the COVID-19 pandemic impact crime? Criminologist Richard Rosenfeld joins us this morning on Mississippi Insight. The Mississippi Economic Council held its annual meeting a couple of weeks back. Workforce development and recovery from the pandemic were top of the agenda. More than 800 business leaders gathered in Jackson to talk about how to boost numbers in the workforce and to train the workers themselves. The council took time to praise the state flag change, and they touted strong revenue numbers for the year, despite the economic hit from COVID-19. But questions remain on many people's minds. How does Mississippi reach parity and then some with other states in economic prosperity and competitiveness? And what are the best options for taking care of the workers who are building Mississippi's future? Joining me now in Studio A is Major General Leon Collins, retired. He is the former Adjutant General of Mississippi's National Guard. He now serves as CEO of MINAC Incorporated. The company provides career training and support services to government agencies and businesses. And Collins is the now 2021-22 chairman of the Mississippi Economic Council. General Collins, welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Byron, thank you for having me today.
First off, talk to us about your takeaways from the annual meeting that happened last month.
Well, I think it was a success. Obviously, we did not have a meeting last year because of the pandemic, but we had the opportunity to come together again this year in somewhat of a reduced capacity from what we've had in previous years, but we still had a full room at the convention center, and I think the business leaders were excited to be able to get out, to see one another again, and to talk about new ways of moving Mississippi forward.
Why is workforce training so critical, and have we been doing something wrong on this front?
I don't know if we've been doing anything wrong. I think in many cases we've got a lot of silo organizations where one organization is doing something, another organization doing something else. But anytime we can bring the organizations together at the same table where we can discuss ways where we can find synergies between them, I think that's one of the things that will help us move forward, and that's one of the things that the MEC is looking to accomplish.
How do you measure competitiveness as a state when it comes to gauging workforce development?
Well, a lot of different factors come into that. One, the number of new businesses that we have established in our state is one key. The number of businesses, established businesses that are achieving some level of success is another way, and then the number of individuals that are actually working here in our state.
How has COVID impacted your company, MINAC, and what are your thoughts on the broader economy here in Mississippi?
Well, you know, MINAC, we're a workforce development and training company. We primarily work with the United States Department of Labor to operate job corps centers around the country. We currently operate either as a prime or a subcontractor in 9 of those centers, and they're located all across the state, from Montgomery, Alabama, Memphis, Tennessee, Shreveport, Louisiana, Excelsior Springs, Missouri, Denison, Iowa, Laurel, Maryland, St. Paul, Minnesota, Minot, North Dakota, and San Francisco, California. And across the spectrum, the pandemic actually shut the Job Corps centers down because we had to send all of our students home. But we were able to then start distance learning. The government purchased Chromebooks and hotspots for all our students to where we could still carry on classes even while the students were at home. And although that didn't satisfy all the needs, it kept the students from getting too far behind.
There's been a perception that many people are reluctant to go back to work because they can make more money on unemployment than on the job. Your thoughts on that and where we stand here in Mississippi?
Well, obviously that money is going to run out at some point, and the smart people will be smart to start looking for opportunities to find gainful employment. And one of the things that we're experiencing at our Job Corps Center, because we have employees that work there every day, is our employees are being recruited to go to work other places because there are so many shortages outside of Job Corps that employers are offering higher wages now, so we're having to try to compete with those higher wages in order to keep our workforce.
We'll have more with Leon Collins when Mississippi Insight continues. What skill sets do you see to be in demand and greater demand here in Mississippi right now?
Well, I think you're still going to have the skills that we teach at the Job Corps centers around the country. There's 125 of them nationwide, and things like carpentry, plumbing, electrician, culinary arts, nurse assistants, I think is going to be one of the big ones. Any type of career field that's in the medical field, I think is going to be big. We don't have any problem placing the young men and women who go through our nursing programs. So I think that's still going to be one of the big ones.
During this year's census, Mississippi was one of 3 states that lost population. How do you address that issue, and how do you get people to want to move to Mississippi?
Well, that's one of the primary focus issues that MEC will be tackling this year. Many people call that the brain drain. How do we keep especially our young people, our best and brightest here in Mississippi? So we've got to figure out a way to stop the decrease and start the increase. We have a lot of young men and women who go to some of our colleges and universities, and once they get their education, they want to get a good job that pays good wages and have great benefits. But then they also want other things. They want social life and that kind of things that in some cases we might not offer here in Mississippi. So we've got to find a way to compete with places like Nashville and Dallas and Houston and Birmingham and Huntsville, those kind of places, Atlanta. So that's one of the things that we're going to be addressing as we do our MEC tour this year. We're going to be talking with the local business leaders and community leaders in the different areas where we go, and we'll start those in about a month now. And we're going to put them in smaller groups and ask very pointed questions, what they think we could do as a state that would change the conversation when we start talking about holding on to our best and brightest young people.
How concerned are people in the MEC and really in our lawmakers about young people leaving the state and not wanting to return?
Well, we're very concerned. As you mentioned, only 3 states this past census lost population. I went back and looked at some of the numbers. If we don't turn that trend around this next 10 years, that's quite a possibility that we could lose a congressional seat. And that's one thing we definitely don't want to lose. We don't want to lose our power in Congress. So that and all that, it's kind of an avalanche effect when something like that happens. I think everybody's very interested in it. I know Speaker Gunn had a conference prior to COVID where we talked about this particular issue and ways that we can address it. And I imagine we'll be talking about that again now that we are on the backside of this pandemic. On
the tip of your mind, what comes to your thoughts when it comes to holding on to some young people? What do you think we need to be doing?
Well, for one thing, we've got to make sure that we're training them in skills that we can employ them in here in Mississippi. I know the state just recently established an Office of Workforce Development, and I think that office will be the key to matching the training and the talent and the opportunities. Anytime you can match those 3, then you have a better opportunity of holding on to your young people. Mm-hmm.
What about the salary? Because a lot of people say they're going to go to Nashville or Dallas or Houston or Atlanta because they can make, much more money.
Well, we're going to have competitive wages, and some of that will come if we are able to attract new businesses here, new technology businesses, for instance. If we can do that, then these young people will see that they can make just as good a living here in Mississippi as they will somewhere else. But yeah, the wages are a big key in their decision to move away.
Are there efforts to get a Fortune 500 company into the state of Mississippi, which we don't have?
Well, there should be. I mean, and you know, like I know, there's only 14 states that don't have a Fortune 500 company in their borders, and Mississippi is one of them. But Mississippi, with the exception of South Carolina, has the largest population of any of those 14. We should be able to attract. I mean, we have a lot of talent here in this state. We have a lot of resources. We probably don't do as good a job of selling ourselves to people. But if we can do a better job in that, then that's a possibility.
How important is it to have an urban center that's thriving? Would that make a difference?
It's important. As I mentioned, we have operations all across the country, and when I go to other states, and especially when I go to their capital city, and I see the things that are going on inside their capital city, the resources they have there, we've got to get Jackson up to par with some of these.
What do you think, bottom line, what do you think Mississippi's private and public sectors need to do to catch up with other states in their economies?
Well, they need to come together at the table, because what I find is people, look at things from different perspectives. And if you can ever get them together to where there's a dialogue, in many cases you can walk away with a compromise. And when you walk in the same direction, you have an opportunity to achieve something.
In the next 10 years, do you believe Mississippi's going to look different than it looks today?
Oh, I believe it will. As a matter of fact, I believe the pandemic, if we're smart, the pandemic gives us an opportunity to hit the reset button. And I think we can move in the right direction. But we've got to come together now. We can't waste any more time. We probably should have already had some of these discussions. But if we come together now, I think we have an opportunity to do something great.
General Collins, thank you for joining us.
All right. Thanks, Byron.
And we'll be right back. It isn't just Jackson or Mississippi facing spikes in violent crime. Cities and states across the country are reporting rising rates of dangerous, often deadly violence. Joining us now is Dr. Richard Rosenfeld. He's a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. His research there focuses on explaining U.S. crime trends. Dr. Rosenfeld, welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Happy to be with you.
What can we make of reports that carjackings, murders, and other violent crimes are on the rise both in Jackson and nationwide?
Those reports are correct. I've done research over the last year on crime rate changes in a few dozen of big cities in the United States, and with very few exceptions, we see rises in violent crime, specifically homicide and gun assault, that are over and above those we would normally expect to see in the spring and summer as the weather heats up.
What factors do you believe are driving these trends?
There's a debate about that. Some people argue that the police have become demoralized during a period of widespread criticism of the police and perceptions that policymakers, some of them, are not supportive enough of the police. The idea here then is the police are pulling back, crime rates go up. On the other side of the debate is the argument that sort of turns that first argument on its head. The argument here is that communities, and in particular disadvantaged communities of color, where the crime rise, the violent crime rise tends to be concentrated, they're pulling back even further from the police, less willing to cooperate with the police in investigations, perhaps more willing to take matters into one's own hands to settle problems, and that's contributed to the rise in violence. We don't know yet just how much either of those factors may have contributed, and for that matter, other factors, such as the sheer stress and strain of the pandemic, may have contributed to the rise. But I would say this about the police pullback argument. If the police were disengaging to that extent, we wouldn't simply expect violent crime to rise, we would expect all types of crime to rise. But it's only violent crime is the only type of crime that we've seen increases. Where we've seen increases, property crime rates went down last year. If it were simply a matter of the police pulling back, we should have seen street crime of all types go up.
Talk a little more about the pandemic and what role that has played as far as crimes compared to where it was in 2019 to 2020 now.
Yeah, the pandemic has had complex effects on crime. I've done recent research indicating that as more people spent greater amounts of time at home because they were out of work, crime rates of all types, including violent crime, went down, other things equal. But of course, other things were not equal last year. The pandemic also imposed enormous stress and strain on the population, and that could have sent crime rates, including violent crime rates, up. So the effect of the pandemic on crime, I would say, is relatively complex. Other factors that should be taken into account, and indeed other facts, is the following. We saw a particularly abrupt rise in crime, homicide specifically, immediately after the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis. That's when we saw crime rates go way up. Now, in part, that could have been because police were redirected to address protest demonstrations, which were widespread across the United States, taken off their normal patrols, and therefore that could have contributed somewhat to the increase. But it also could well have meant that in communities where the police violence, as well as overall levels of violence, are concentrated, the perception of the police, confidence in the police plummeted. Police legitimacy, as it's called, went down. And that could well have contributed to the increase in violence. So we don't have a definitive answer for what explains the increase. A combination of factors more or less associated with the pandemic and the social unrest we saw last year around police violence. Those are the places to look.
What sort of solutions are suggested by your research, and what's working elsewhere, for instance?
Well, if we had very effective solutions that I could refer to, we wouldn't be seeing so many cities continuing to see relatively strong or sharp increases in violence. I would say the effective approaches have to proceed down two pathways, and they're very, very much connected. On the one hand, I don't think we're going to bring down levels of violence anytime soon without, in a good faith way, addressing calls, the constructive calls for police reform. By that, I do not mean slashing willy-nilly police budgets necessarily. What I do mean is for citizens of Jackson and other places, deciding what it is they want from their local police department. And if they want the police to devote more time and attention to addressing serious crime, and in a city like Jackson, where the police budget, overall budgets are strained, the police budget is strained, number of officers is limited, I would say Jackson probably should find ways for their officers to devote more time and attention to serious crime. Then other activities in which we have our police engaged have to be reallocated to other areas. Dealing with the day-to-day problems and living of the homeless, responding to drug overdose. I think those activities, many of those calls for service can be and should be redirected to public health, social service agencies, EMS services whose personnel are simply better trained to handle them. And clearly the public wants police to be held accountable for verified instances of police misconduct. So that has to proceed ahead if we're going to have a reduction in violence. And the Jackson police, like the police everywhere, have to redouble their efforts at so-called smart policing, which basically involves focusing any and all resources on those areas of the city where violence has traditionally been concentrated and where the recent spike is concentrated. Those are the two pathways that cities like Jackson should proceed along, and I certainly am not arguing it's going to be an easy task.
Dr. Rosenfeld, thank you for your comments and for your research. We appreciate your time and joining us here on Mississippi Insight.
You're quite welcome.
Not long after we recorded that interview, Jackson reached 75 homicides for the year so far. 12 News' Walt Grayson commented this week on the violence in his Mississippi moment.
Well, it's to the point that people who don't live here say they're afraid to come to Jackson because of the crime. Of course, there are lots of bigger cities around the nation where crime is surging. not to mention all the smaller cities that are doing the same thing. So what's Jackson's problem? Well, mostly it's people shooting each other. Now, why are they doing that? They're probably mad at each other for some reason. And there can be any number of reasons for that. I mean, from a festering grudge to a problem with drugs or a spur-of-the-moment reaction. But the way I see it, I wouldn't think any of it is worth shooting someone over. And I figure after the parties involved kind of cool down, most of them wouldn't see it as worth shooting or getting shot over either. And I'd imagine the gloating over winning an argument by killing someone sort of wears off pretty quickly into a long prison sentence. But I don't know. I've never asked anyone in that situation. I know if it was me, I'd just be wishing I'd call him a name or something. Some sociologists say it's because of poor parenting or a lack of fathers in the house. And I'm not smart enough to know that either. But since I am old enough to be not only a father, but a grandfather, let me tell you something my dad told me back when I was a teenager. Now, listen to me. He said, son, nothing good happens after midnight. That's it. Now, if you're off the streets before midnight, odds are you'll still be alive the next morning. But we have at least 75 people in Jackson so far this year who weren't alive the next day. Now, not all of them, but the vast majority of them were killed after midnight. Now, if you're a teenager and your parents won't make you be home by midnight, then you make yourself be home by midnight. You be the grown-up. We need you alive. We got plenty of other news stories to report than someone else having been shot at 3:30 in the morning somewhere in a place where they shouldn't have been to begin with. We'll be right back.
Big thanks this week to my next General Leon Collins and Dr. Richard Rosenfeld from the University of Missouri at St. Louis. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.